Good morning to everyone. Glad to see everyone here on this bright sunny morning. The sun's shining in from the outside. The wind's nice and keeps it nice and fresh. Air moving around. One way to look at it. It's West Texas. We're used to the wind. We are here in this final week of our examination of the book of Genesis and how it influences our faith, especially our New Testament theology. And we are looking at the book of Revelation and kind of doing a summation at the end of that today. As we take a look at this, we've gone through the book of Genesis, and then we've gone through the other 26 books of the New Testament. We are in the final book of the Revelation of John this week. So the book of Revelation, it's one of those books. Actually, Chris is using that as one of his main sermon texts this morning. That wasn't a plan. Don't know his sermon topics. But as we're looking at that, usually we get some preaching on it from those first letters at the beginning, is what some preachers will use, and they'll use some preaching on it from the end of it, and then in the middle of that, usually people leave that untouched because it's hard to understand. It is written in apocryphal language. It's written as a prophetic language. As we look at as the Apostle John was giving a view of the end times and giving hope to the people of his day. It was written by the Apostle John near the end of the first century. Most scholars believe it's written about AD 95, which would put it about 25 years after the fall of Jerusalem. So Jews are in the Jewish Christians are in disarray. The persecution has really stepped up among the early church. To where John is one of the last living, if not the last living apostle of the time. It's now been 65 years approximately since Jesus has been crucified and ascended into heaven. And so you're now more than a generation and a half out from those people who are eyewitnesses to Jesus, and they're wondering, how long are we going to wait? We've seen so many pass and go to sleep. We've seen, was the language that Paul used. We've seen so many that are being persecuted now. Is this really worth it? What we decided to follow after Jesus, and John is giving them the hope that yes, it is worth it. There's going to be something. It's going to be a while. It might be a while before we see the full fruits of this, but it is worth it because in the end, God wins. And that's the basic message of Revelation, is that no matter what, there's going to be tribulation. There's going to be things that we don't understand. But in the end, God wins. The word revelation is a translation of the Greek word apocalypsis, which is where we get our word apocalypse. It means an unveiling or a disclosure. It offers a blessing to everyone who reads it, and a blessing to even those who obey. Because of that message, God wins. Revelation is John's fifth and last New Testament book. He wrote the Gospel of John, his 3 letters, general letters to the church, and then this final book of the New Testament. In the Gospel of John, he wrote about Jesus as God's Son and the Savior of all who believe on him. In the letter 1 John, he offered several evidence of the believer's salvation. In 2 John, he emphasized the importance of Christian love and sound doctrine. In 3 John, he wrote about loyalty to the truth and the need to walk in the truth. Revelation reveals how prophetic passages in the Old Testament foretell yet future events will be fulfilled. It shows how the events predicted in Matthew 24 and 25 and then in 2 Thessalonians will eventually come to pass. The book of Revelation begins with John's declaration that God had given him the revelation of Jesus Christ, and he extends a greeting like the Apostle Paul's greeting in his letters. He greets his readers with grace and peace from Jesus Christ, whom he identifies as trustworthy, eternal, and sovereign. He ascribes glory and power forever to Jesus because of his love and redemption. John views believers as appointed by the Lord to be a kingdom of priests, to serve God and the Father. And he views Jesus in his letters that he received, and especially the one to the church in Laodicea, he views them as Jesus as the creator. So there's one of your first references as we're looking at, that Jesus was there in the creation. We've looked at that at several other passages, both when he started off his gospel, as well as some passages in the epistles from Paul, that Jesus was there. Nothing was created without him. But there's some more allusions that we see as we look through this revelation from John, and how does it tie back to the book of Genesis? The first one that's most obvious as we go through this is the Garden of Eden. The Bible begins and it ends with the imagery of perfection. It starts with it in the book of Genesis, where God creates what was good. Not only good, but he calls it very good after the creation of man. After he saw what he had created, he said that it was very good. And he placed man in the Garden of Eden, and they lived there, Adam and Eve, and they walked with God, and they only had the one rule: don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then other than that, they were free to do as they wished as they walked through the garden. But how do we come back to that? God's goal all throughout the Old and New Testament is to bring us back to a state where we can be back in that state with him and walking with him on a regular basis. Our goal is not even to get to heaven. Our goal is to be like and with Jesus in the end. Our goal is to be back with Jesus in that state where we can walk with God in the cool of the day. John tells them a story in Revelation chapter 22 that he has this symbolic vision of this great rebirth. He saw the new heaven and the new earth, a clear reference to the very beginning of this biblical narrative. So what did it look like? In Revelation 22, it says, "So then he showed me a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb in the middle of the street. On either side of the river was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations." It's an all-new Garden of Eden, the paradise of eternal life with God. This is an image of the Old Testament prophetic echoing all the way back to the first pages of Genesis. John saw the tree of life there, accessible to all. Remember that when in Genesis chapter 3 that they were cut off because they partook of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they understood and they tried to be like God. And God said, "I don't want you to be like me. I want you to be with me." He doesn't want us to be our own individual gods. And we try to be that so much in our pride and our greed. We think we have it all in hand. And he tells us, that's not what I need you to be. I need you to just be with me. And he calls us to rely on him. He calls us to be in that harmony with him. In John's account of the garden, humanity wasn't represented by that couple, though, Adam and Eve. John describes seeing all the nations there, that everybody can partake in this garden. Everybody can partake of the tree of life once again, that produces he says it produces its fruit once a month, and everybody is able to partake of it. For John, the fulfillment of God's purpose through Jesus would result in the restoration of humans to their place as being that having the dominion that God originally established, ready to work with God to take creation into uncharted territory. He specifically mentions that tree of life. After the introductory greetings and a description of the risen Christ, John records a series of messages of oracles to the churches at Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and finally to Laodicea at the end of chapter 3. Each of those messages ends with a promise to the one who overcomes. He's telling them, every one of them starts off with a message saying, to the one who overcomes, and gives them a promise. The first of these promises to the church at Ephesus was in chapter 2, verse 7, was to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. We are immediately reminded of Adam and Eve's expulsion from the Garden of Eden, lest Adam, in chapter 3, verse 22 of Genesis says, reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life, and he ate and lived forever. The text does not say why this would be a bad thing. Why did he kick them out of the garden? Why couldn't they live forever? But it does say that it was a part of the couple's, it was related to the couple's act of disobedience earlier, which has led to the man knowing good and evil. But then that's also a characteristic of the heavenly beings. See the man who has become like us in Genesis 3:22. See the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Israel's teachers of wisdom used the tree of life to create colorful metaphors. For example, in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 18, it says, she, wisdom, is a tree of life to those who lay a hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called blessed. And in cases like this, the tree language serves as a hyperlink back to God's ideal for humanity in Genesis chapter 2. The biblical writers invite us to recall the tree's association with abundance to make the connection between living wisely and enjoying a full life, or the life-giving effects that wisdom has on others. The tree of life also reappears as a symbol in Israel's worship. We see it in the tabernacle, and then later in the temple in Jerusalem. There's so much garden language as you read through the descriptions as they were building the tabernacle, specifically the tree of life as a part of that. It was a symbol over and over again. So it's not unusual that John uses that as a part of his language of what it's going to be at the end. It's incorporated into the design of sacred spaces. It portrays them as miniature gardens of Eden in those holy spaces, the tabernacle and the temple. Adorning both of those gardens was a golden lampstand, which took the form of a stylized tree. The garden and the tree imagery is intended as hyperlinks back to Genesis 2. It's designed to encourage Israel to remember their special part in God's plan to restore creation. Like Adam and Eve, the nation of Israel was faced with a choice. Would they heed those reminders, obey God's commands, and channel life to the nations around them? Or would they look to other gods and seek to define good and evil and bad for themselves? Because that's what happens when we allow ourselves to become to either fashion gods after our own hands and our own ideals. We decide what is good and evil for ourselves. And in today's society, we see it even more prevalent. We decide what's good and evil. The world will say, God wouldn't want that for me. He surely does want that for you. He wants life for you. And he's telling you how to gain life. But you can't decide what's good and evil in your own eyes. If you decide what's good and evil in your own eyes, then you're not going to have what's truly life. When Jesus, the Messiah, came, he demonstrated an unswerving reliance on God and perfect obedience to him. That is to say, he did what humans failed to do in choosing to eat from the other tree in the garden and to find good and evil for themselves. He looked to God. He used God's definitions of what was good and evil to define that and then clarify that for us, that it wasn't just about the actions, it's about the heart. God had been pointing to that ever since the beginning. He redefined it again when he crowned King David. He said, man looks at the outward, God looks at the heart. And Jesus took that and ran with it further, and he demonstrated that for us. His reliance and obedience also accomplished what God's chosen people couldn't do. He channeled abundant life to the nations. The cross is actually referred to as a tree throughout the New Testament. It's through his death and resurrection that Jesus himself becomes the source of life for those who choose to follow him. The tree of life reappears in the final chapters of the Bible, but not merely as a figure of speech. The tree of life is a physical feature, according to John, at the center of God's restored creation. This new tree is described as prominently sitting upon a river that's emanating directly from the throne. It produced 12 kinds of fruit, yield its fruit each month, and bear leaves for the healing of the nations. These details demonstrate its vitality, its abundance, its healing properties. The healing of the nations is a curious feature of this tree. Likely indicate the leaves, and presumably the tree itself will serve as a reminder of how the nations have been healed. But how? It's through the work of Jesus. The work of Jesus is the ultimate source of life. His death on the cross, his resurrection was the ultimate source of healing, the ultimate source of life. And it's healed their natural bent to disobey God and reconcile them to the Creator. The new tree of life certainly mirrors the original tree in the Garden of Eden, providing hope of a sustained life with Yahweh. In this way, the tree both recalls the garden story and also provides an expectation of future hope. These bookends of the tree of life, both being at the very beginning and the very end. You see it in Genesis chapter 2. You see it in the very last chapter of Revelation. They frame the entire biblical story, but they also highlight the completion of God's redemptive plan. For us, the new tree of life serves as a reminder that God's purposes will not be thwarted. The tree that was lost will be replanted. The creation that was lost is restored. Therefore, we can look to the future with great confidence and hope. But in the meantime, we have this. In Genesis chapter 3, we get introduced to a new character, the serpent. What do we know about the serpent? First, he is bad news. This is a creature who is on a mission to disrupt God's good, ordered world. A chaos monster, if you will. The serpent is the Bible's first portrayal of evil and independence from God. From this point on, when the authors want to talk about evil, they use serpent or dragon imagery. Second, the serpent's own chaos mission isn't enough. He also tries to persuade others to join. The first humans take the bait, and a pattern is established. Spiritual rebellion behind human rebellion. Spiritual powers behind earthly evil. But God promises that though humanity will be oppressed by the serpent, one day a snake-crushing Savior will come and deliver God's people. If Jesus beat the monster when he died and was raised again, then why is there still so much evil in the world? That was definitely a question of the first century church. And it's still a question today. Why do good people suffer evil? After all, decades have passed since Jesus' resurrection, and his followers were being persecuted by enemies on every side. They were facing persecution by the Roman government. They were facing persecution by their fellow Jews who wouldn't follow after Jesus. They were facing persecution by the Gentiles who saw these people as, why wouldn't you follow after our gods? They were facing persecution on every side. In Revelation, John gives them the answer, though. In the midst, in the answer to the question, a reason to hope in the midst of this monstrous evil. Revelation is written in apocalyptic style. We talked about that earlier. A type of ancient literature that uses a collage of symbols to communicate meanings. Because so many of its ideas are communicated imagery, it can be hard to understand. It also gives unusually vivid portrayals and mysterious glimpses of what is really going on in the heavenly realm. And its message about the fate of the monstrous enemy, the Bible's great villain, it's a hopeful one. In Revelation, the monster is not a slithering serpent, but it's a mighty dragon. And we see back in the serpent in Genesis chapter 3 that the curse was that it would no longer walk, which entails that it was going to be it would always eat the dust of the ground from that point on. So maybe the serpent is a little bit different than we think of as a snake today. So maybe it was a dragon at the time or something along those lines, a serpent-type figure that keeps that same imagery along. You had something, Travis?
The key is the fact that He made us as free moral agents. We're not robots. And people can choose to do wrong, many do. I guess the majority do choose the wrong way. But He doesn't want robots. He wants people to choose Him.
He wants...
And so many people choose wrong. That's the reason there's so much problem.
That the world is groaning. Travis said that it's people's choices and why things are going that way. It's what we talked about just a moment ago. That it's about that we try and define our own gods knowing between good and evil, and we think we know what's best. But when the serpent tempts, could Eve and Adam both said no? Yeah, they could have easily said no. But if they hadn't done it, I probably would have done it too. Chris has said that too. Is that because every day we have to make a choice, and we don't live perfect lives. If they hadn't have been the one that done it, Seth and Cain and Abel would have done it. Somebody would have chosen that, made a poor choice somewhere along that way. It wasn't just on those two individuals. But that attack in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 was an attack on the woman and her offspring. It brings a faint recollection back when we look in Revelation. It says in Genesis 3:15, it says, I shall put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. It's a specific indication when we come into Revelation chapter 12 that's significant. Revelation chapter 12 verse 9 says, and the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And the apostle, in this verse, the apostle John refers to Satan as that ancient serpent, a reference to his appearance in the Garden of Eden to tempt our first parents. John also calls him diabolos in Greek, which is where we get the word the devil, or a term meaning, but that's not his name. His name isn't the devil. That just means the slanderer or the opponent. That's what he does. He's the devil. He's a slanderer and opponent. The entity is the deceiver of the whole world. He also gets the name Satanas. It's the Greek word derived from the Hebrew name for the leader of the evil spirit, Satan. The entity is the deceiver of the whole world. As Jesus said, the devil was a liar and the father of lies in John chapter 8. Proof that Satan deceives the whole world may be found in those who think success brings true happiness, or the things of this world bring lasting pleasure, or that money offers security. It may also be found in the false religions and cults that reject or twist the truth. Since that identification is repeated again in Revelation chapter 20, it is clear that John wishes to conclude a bookend from the Garden of Eden story. That serpent in that story that deceived Eve has become the deceiver of the whole world. But it will finally, at the end times, be destroyed in the lake of fire, bringing the whole story of disobedience and rebellion to a close. The dragon launches his rebellion against God and is thrown down to earth to continue his war against God's people. A loud voice from heaven, though, proclaims that the adversary accuses God's people day and night. But they have conquered him through the blood of the Lamb. In other words, it's not anything that we're going to do. We can choose to do good all day. But how many sins does it take to separate us from God? Just one. And there's no way we can live a perfect life. One person has done that. It's only through the blood of the Lamb that we can beat the accusations of the devil. Because all it takes is, how many crimes does it take to send you away for life in our justice system today? Just one. One decision, one poor decision could send you away for years. Same thing when we try and measure up against a holy God. We can't do it. But it's the blood of the Lamb, and that's what he cries out in Revelation, that it's the blood of the Lamb that finally beats the accuser. Because that's the only thing that washes us white as snow. Because Jesus conquered the monster, now his people, that's us, are conquerors. Though the battle continues, its ending is certain. In fact, the climax of the book of Revelation, John has a vision of the monster's destiny. When the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, is bound and cast out of the new creation forever. It also refers back to Sodom and Gomorrah. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19 became the exemplar of judgment. We see it over and over again. In the Old Testament, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Zephaniah all refer to the judgment of God and refer back to Sodom to talk about that judgment. In the New Testament, Jesus talks about it in Matthew. Paul talks about it in Romans. Peter talks about it in 2 Peter chapter 2. And Jude talks about it also. It's a symbol of judgment. Sodom is named also here in Revelation chapter 11, verse 8. And it's alluded to in Revelation chapter 9, verse 2. As well as other texts in Revelation where it talks about fire and sulfur. In the vision of the two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11, their prophetic ministry is brought to an end by the beast, and their bodies are said to lie in the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. This is symbolic of the destruction of Jerusalem 25 years previous, and the judgment that was passed on them, like in Sodom and Egypt, that was prophesied by Jesus during his ministry. For all that, it's not surprising that when these men are finally killed, they don't receive a decent burial. Instead, their bodies that are in Revelation chapter 11, they don't receive a decent burial. Instead, their bodies are left in the street like animal carcasses. Like so many prophets before them, the two witnesses experienced martyrdom. Jesus indicted Jerusalem for killing the prophets and stoning those who were sent to it in Matthew chapter 23. The street is in the great city that some expositors identify as Rome or Babylon. However, the context argues for this being Jerusalem. Verse 8 indicates that the great city is where our Lord was crucified. Jesus died on a cross outside Jerusalem, not outside Rome or Babylon. John tells us that the great city symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt. In the tribulation, Jerusalem will be morally corrupt, like Sodom, and its residents will be in bondage to the beast that controls the economy and their lives. One might conclude that John is simply using a stock image when it talks about this for judgment. In Revelation chapter 9, verse 2. But it says, in Revelation chapter 9, he says, he opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. That's a deliberate reference to Genesis chapter 19, verse 20, 27, 28, where Abraham looks over the city. After the next morning afterwards, he looks out from his tent. He can see, and it's Abraham, we went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before with the Lord, just a few days before, when he had bargained with the Lord, trying to get him to see, can you find just a few holy men in this city? Can you find just 10? We bargained him all the way down from 50 to 10. And then he finally comes up and he says, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. According to the verse, when Satan opens the shaft of the bottomless pit, it's dense, extremely hot smoke is billowing from the shaft. The smoke is so heavy and black that it darkens the sun and the earth's atmosphere. The pollution that spews from the bottomless pit is an appropriate environment for those fallen angels. If paradise transformed is an appropriate description of the salvation in Revelation, then Sodom magnified describes the destruction of all that would go against it. The next image that we see is the Lion of Judah that comes from Genesis. A lion is a universal symbol for power and strength. It occurs over 150 times in the Old Testament, sometimes for the actual animal, but mostly as a metaphor for devouring enemies. In Numbers 23, it talks about a lioness rises up, and as a lion it lifts itself. It does not lie down until it has devoured the prey and drunk the blood of the slain. Other passages portray God as a lion, either fighting on behalf of Israel or against her. But in Revelation chapter 5, he talks about that that's not the image that he's using. He's not using it as a symbol of power. He's gonna contrast it and take this from Genesis 49. In Revelation chapter 5, verse 5, it says, "And one of the elders said to me, weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." He portrays the lion as the lion of the tribe of Judah, but he also talks about it being with the lambs, that it's as mighty as the lion, but it's as gentle as the lamb. In Genesis chapter 49, the blessing afforded to Judah says, "Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, he has washed his garments in wine and his vesture in the blood of grapes." This text is widely understood as messianic. It's talking about the coming of Jesus, that Jesus will come from the tribe of Judah, which he does as a descendant of David. But Jesus is not only that. He's the Messiah from the tribe of Judah, but he defeats his enemies in battle and rules over them as King and Lord. However, when we see him here in Revelation, it's slightly different because we talk about that he's not just the lion that's mighty in power. Well, that's great. It shows how he's able to be in a slightly different position. It shows a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered. That's the unusual feature here. That a lion is laying there as if it was a lamb, slaughtered for the nations. The traditional expectation of messianic conquest by military deliverance, that the Lion of Judah is reinterpreted so that messianic conquest comes through the sacrificial death of the Lamb. By reinterpreting the militant Messiah and his army, John does not mean simply to set aside Israel's hopes for triumph in the end times. He wants to redefine what does it mean to win. It's not about winning outright with a military conquest. It's not about going and beating it down people's throats that Jesus is the answer, you need to go to him. It's about being like a lamb, being willing to sacrifice yourself for others, demonstrating love for others just like Jesus did. And he's showing them that that's what it really means to win. And he uses that Lion of Judah that you can be a winner in the same way that Jesus was. The spiritual victory, it was won on the cross. But when Christ returns, he will exercise force against the partisans of evil, and he will punish them as they deserve. There's a complete cycle here in Revelation that comes from Genesis. When we look at this, you can see that the cycle comes full circle. In Genesis chapter 1, we see the creation of heaven and earth. In Revelation 21, we see the revealing of the new heaven and the new earth. In Genesis chapter 2, you have the Eden sanctuary, the river that flowed out of Eden, and the tree of life. In Revelation 21, you see the sanctuary of the New Jerusalem, the river that flowed from the New Jerusalem, and the tree of life. Genesis chapter 2, you see the bridegroom, the bride, and the wedding of Adam and Eve. But in Revelation 19 and 21, you see the bride is really the church. You see the bridegroom is really Christ. And it's the wedding of those together, the wedding of the Lamb, that's so important. In Genesis chapter 3, you see Satan and the woman, Eve. In Revelation chapter 12, you see Satan and the new woman, the new Eve, that Satan is still persecuting the church. In Genesis chapter 3, you see the curse. In Revelation 22, you see that now the curse is abolished. There's going to be nothing that is cursed in heaven. In Genesis chapter 3, death enters into creation. In Revelation chapter 20, death is destroyed. In Genesis chapter 10, Babylon is built, judgment upon the nations. But in Revelation chapter 14, Babylon is destroyed. Judgment is upon the nations. In Genesis chapter 3, the Redeemer is promised. And in Revelation chapter 20, the victorious Redeemer reigns. It comes full cycle. Those first 11 chapters of Genesis, you see them there as a quick overview of the story of the beginning of mankind. It covers several thousand years. But why is it important? It's because Revelation comes and picks it up and answers all those questions from Genesis. When we see these, sorry, I didn't realize it didn't go on to the next screen, but those are next four that I was reading from. That when you see this full completion of the cycle, John draws on diverse texts to offer his own vision of how the story that began in Genesis is going to end. That full cycle, that full completion of here's where it began, here's where it's going to end. And then we come to the final. I took all the scriptures that we've referenced over these last 13 weeks. How many times is the book of Genesis referenced over the course of the New Testament? Hundreds of times. The book of Genesis, it's required to understand the book of Genesis to be able to understand the New Testament. How many times do we see up here the fact that in Matthew and Mark, it's used constantly throughout them. The book of Luke, it's used at the beginning as it's telling the beginning of the story of Jesus. In the book of John, it's used throughout. The book of Acts is used at the very beginning as it's told to the story of the Hebrews. In Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians. There's a little gap right there in the letter in Second Thessalonians through Philemon, but then Hebrews it picks right back up and expects you to know that for the rest of the book. The book of Genesis is critical to an understanding of the rest of the Bible. By understanding how creation is a critical part of our story of faith. By understanding how it builds towards the rest of the story, we can see that we can see how the book of Genesis, every one of these chapters, with the exception of a little bit in the story of Joseph and some of the lineages, is used and understood throughout the rest of the New Testament. I want to take these last 5 minutes of this class. What did you take out of this class? What are some things that we can carry forward and as we finish out this study of Genesis? This is open time for question and answers. Barry?
The old validates the new, and the new validates the old, and it's all connected, layered.
Yep. Barry said the old validates the new validates the old, and it's all connected. To understand the old, you have to understand the new, and to understand the new, you have to understand the old. The people of the Old Testament, people of the Jewish history understood that. Yes?
Nothing was an accident. Everything was completely mapped out from beginning to end. Nothing happened that wasn't supposed to happen. It was all part of the plan.
It was all part of the plan. Nothing that happened was an accident. It was all part of the plan from beginning to end, and you can see that as we look through there. That God has His hand in everything, and we can see it manifesting itself as we look through those stories of Genesis. Even things that we think were mistakes, God used them for His redemptive purpose, and we can see that in our lives.
Like she said, it's mapped out from Genesis to Revelation. And nothing was by accident.
Nothing by accident.
God had this in His mind since forever. It took an awful lot of Bible study to pick up on that.
That it was a part of the complete story. It's a part of the complete plan when we see this coming from Genesis all the way to Revelation. Travis,
Yield not to temptation.
you want to expand on that? Yield not to temptation.
There's plenty of it in there.
Oh, in the book of Genesis.
No temptation that can come but what is common to man. But God is faithful and not allowed to be tempted above that which we are able, but with every temptation provide a way of escape. We see that all the way through the Bible, of course, all through that. But the fact that you don't have to yield to temptation. There's always a way provided. We see that some took the right way and many took the wrong way.
That 1 Corinthians 10 passage tells us that there's no temptation taken us except what is common to man. He's always going to provide a way. But even if we do yield to temptation, God still yields a plan out of it. He's got a plan in place. And the plan was started in Genesis chapter 3 when they succumbed to temptation. But if you do succumb to it, there's a way out of it, because God provides us the blood of the cross to be able to escape from that, and he uses those for His redemptive purpose.
The same God that created and the same God of wrath is also the same God that hung on the cross.
The same God, the one who we see created, who has the power of creation. He demonstrates wrath against those who decide to just completely ignore Him and don't seek after Him. But He's also that wrath is also a mixture of love. Some people don't see how those two can come together. How can you punish me when I do something wrong? But God wants to discipline you back into His fold. He wants to bring you back into there. And that story of Genesis shows that over and over again, how He's continuing to bring you back into that fold.
It's interesting to me that God is a spirit, but He made Himself in human form to be on the earth.
That
Talk with people and visit with them, tell them what they should do.
back in Genesis, it shows that He was walking with people, even in a spirit form. That He was a spirit. He walked with Enoch, he walked with Adam and Eve, he talked to Noah, he talked to Abraham, he came and visited with Abraham, even when he had the 3 visitors. It says the Lord was there. But not only that, he came in a human form in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When we see Jesus, that he came in a human form and lived his entire life as a human. That a God that is the creator of the universe, that spoke things that can speak and things come into existence, was willing to live here on this earth and be our Redeemer. Thank you for all your attention. I believe Clay Peterson picks up next week in this Bible class. Thank you for your attention, and it was a great Bible study with you.